Hey, and welcome to Managing Expectations. Today, I'm going to be talking about King Lear, which is a play written by Shakespeare, which is on production right now at Stockholm's National Theatre. I'm going to be giving you some advice about how you can get the most out of coming to Stockholm's National Theatre, especially for those of you who don't speak Swedish or are still learning Swedish, and some history about the theatre itself, and obviously, if I think it's worth your time. The first thing you need to know about this version of King Lear is that it's a reimagining, which I think is important to call out here because before I went to the show, I actually didn't know what a reimagining was in the context of theater. And if you're like me, sitting through 3, maybe even 4 hours of Shakespeare doesn't necessarily bring you a whole lot of joy. I went online to figure out what does reimagining actually mean. And there's a really great article by Vox about what a reimagining actually means. And I'll put a link in the description to that article. And Vox goes on to write that a reimagining means something has been added to or changed from the original that alters it in some way. Now, I'm no expert in theater, but the change in adds to is certainly relevant in this context about how dramaten actually reimagined this really, really old show by Shakespeare into something that felt a lot more modern. So in the context of reimagining, the show does 2 things. The first is that it changes where the play actually takes place. Now, in the original plot, it takes place in England, and this reimagined version certainly does take place in England, but it's in a setting that doesn't necessarily feel like it's in the 1600s. Rather, it's modern day, maybe just in a world where a king has absolute power, which honestly doesn't sound that great based off of what I saw in the play. The second thing this play does is that it adds this element of all of the cast stepping away from the world of King Lear that's been created on stage into kind of a group of actors rehearsing, which I think was really effective in making it feel more modern. And you might be wondering, what is King Lear actually about? I'm chiming in to say that if you're enjoying this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you really like this video, consider subscribing. So King Lear is about a British king who decides to give his kingdom to his 3 daughters. And to do so, he breaks it into 3 pieces with the condition that each of his 3 daughters must confess their admiration to their father, the king. The first 2 daughters do that easy peasy, but the 3rd daughter had some issues with it and was ultimately banished to France, which seems a little harsh. And without going into too much detail about the show, because it's 5 parts and could be several YouTube videos, this is a tragedy and therefore you probably know how this whole play ends. But overall, given that the show did a lot to make it feel more modern and didn't even use any like old Swedish or even old English, it was really nice to watch and didn't feel as stuffy as I expected the show to actually be. And by the way, King Lear in its original production was performed in 1606, which is like 200 years before Gustav Vasa III inaugurated dramaten. So now that that little bit of history is over, I can say that Gustav Vasa III is really well known not only for starting Dramaten, but also getting the opera house going in Stockholm as well. So today, Dramaten is owned by the Swedish state and has an official assignment by the government to not only advance the art of theater, but to also preserve Swedish theatric arts. And if you've ever been to a stage show in New York or London, you know that going to a theater can be really expensive. And one of the benefits of it being owned by the state is that the tickets for Dramaten can be really, really affordable. In fact, I've never seen the cost of a ticket for an adult go above 510 Swedish kroner, which is pretty remarkable given the impressive production itself, but that you also see some actors that you will have seen in Swedish movies and TV on the stage itself. Like I mentioned, I've never seen a ticket be more than 510 Swedish kroner, which me and my husband saw a show in New York recently, and I think we paid a little over 200. And those were the absolute cheapest tickets we could find for the show that we wanted to see. They also offer student prices, so if you are a student in Stockholm or maybe somewhere else in the world and you're coming to visit Stockholm, make sure you buy the student price. And if you are coming to Stockholm, make sure you buy your tickets a couple weeks in advance because I have seen tickets sell out really quickly. And if you want to go to a show where they offer the translation, which I'll get to later in this video, definitely need to buy that in advance. And you might be wondering, like, why is Dramaten so popular? Well, firstly, it is Sweden's national stage and it's pretty old. It was founded in 1788 by that guy Gustav Vasa III, and the original home for Dramaten was near the palace in Gamlestan. But after a few years, the building got into some bad shape and was later moved to Kungsträdgården. And the house that it was in was a house called Märkelös, and it was this beautiful mansion at the south side of Kungsträdgården. And it stayed there actually for quite some time. And in 1825, a fire broke out and they had to move the theater again. And before it actually got to the 1900s, when Dramaten was opened where it lives today at Nypoplan, a ton of history took place in that time, but I'm not even going to try to go into detail. But if you're interested, maybe I'll make another video. So after that fire, Dramaten moved around around a bit and ultimately found its home at Nybroplan in 1908, where it still is today. And honestly, the building's stunning. If you are going to a show at Dramaten, I recommend getting there at least an hour before so you can enjoy something bubbly in one of the beautiful rooms where you have all of these fantastic paintings, and it ultimately is a place where you can also order your drinks to be served during the intermission, because if you are going to the show, it's 3 hours and you're going to probably need a snack in between the first and second act. So I mentioned earlier that if you're visiting Stockholm and you don't speak Swedish, that it's still totally possible for you to go to see a show in English. And to do that, I'm going to put some instructions on the screen. But basically, you want to find a date that it says that there's translation services available. And when you book one of those tickets, you'll show up to the theater maybe a half hour before, and you'll go to the ticketing booth and ask for a translation. And then they'll hand you this iPad that you can switch between English and Swedish. So if you are watching this video and you do live in Stockholm and maybe learning Swedish, you can actually watch this show in Swedish as well. If you're using the translation, you're going to have the iPad in your lap while you're watching the show, which means that if you're sitting on the parquet, you're going to be looking up and down. So I recommend sitting on the balcony where you're going to have a bit more of a natural view of the stage with the translation on your lap, so you're not having to look up and down, which is not only uncomfortable, but also like not a natural way to watch the show. The translation is also live, so as the actors are speaking, the text on your iPad is going to be moving. There were a couple of moments where I noticed that it was slightly out of sync, or the actors might be improvising, or there is a section of this particular show that wasn't offered in translation. So in those moments, you're just going to have to enjoy whatever they're saying, even though you don't understand it. 90% of the time, it was actually accurate. Since we're talking about watching a show at Dramaten in English, I learned that they actually did their first international tour in 1962 at the Seattle World Fair, which is not to be confused with the World Fair, but it's kind of like Seattle's own version of it. And during that time, Dramaten performed at the Seattle Playhouse, and they did 3 different shows. And they actually even went to New York and performed at the Court Theater, which is now the James Earl Jones Theater, which you can still go today in New York. So do I think that seeing King Lear at Dramaten is worth your time? Yeah, totally. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a big fan of Shakespeare, but I thought it was really cool that they did this kind of modern reimagining of the show, which made it so much more engaging. And it's also great to get there early, enjoy a drink, enjoy the beautiful atmosphere that's this really old theater with so much history. And lastly, knowing that there's an option to go see a show there with an English translation makes it all the more worth going, particularly if you're coming to Stockholm on a visit. So with that said, thank you so much for watching this episode of Managing Expectations. Please like and subscribe.